My name is Madison Blake. I'm 34 years old. And the day that destroyed everything wasn't when I lost my clearance, or when I processed out of Quantico with nightmares that followed me home like shadows that wouldn't quit. It was standing in my own kitchen in Cedar Falls, watching my husband Ryan slide divorce papers across the counter while his mother Margaret stood behind him like a disapproving judge delivering a verdict. "A laundrywoman," Margaret announced with the theatrical disgust of someone addressing a moral failure. "My son married someone who scrubs other people's dirty clothes for minimum wage. You've disgraced this entire family." The words hit like shrapnel from an IED I never saw coming. Around me, our suburban kitchen granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, the life we'd built when Ryan thought marrying an entrepreneur would make him look successful, suddenly felt like a courtroom where I'd already been found guilty. "I can't do this anymore, Madison," Ryan added, his voice carrying that mixture of embarrassment and finality that husbands use when they're disposing of wives who no longer serve their image. "I can't be married to someone who smells like bleach and lives among other people's stains." Tonight, he was just signing papers to divorce someone whose courage had once saved lives while he'd been safe in business school, learning to sell policies to suburban families. Sunshine Laundromat sat on Elm Street like a forgotten promise, wedged between Murphy's Hardware and a vacant storefront that had been for lease since the recession hit Cedar Falls. The building's yellow paint was peeling in strips that looked like old scars, and the neon sign buzzed with the kind of electrical problems that meant I'd be lucky to break even most months. But it was mine. The first thing I'd owned outright since leaving the bureau. Paid for with separation pay and disability benefits that came with questions I wasn't ready to answer. 800 square feet of industrial washers, coin-operated dryers, and the constant smell of bleach that had become my signature scent whether I wanted it or not. Tuesday afternoon brought the usual crowd. Mrs. Patterson with her weekly load of church clothes that smelled like mothballs and disappointment. College kids from the community college who paid in quarters they'd scrounged from couch cushions. Working mothers who looked at me with the polite sympathy reserved for women who'd clearly made wrong turns somewhere along the way. I was folding a load of towels, hotel white, industrial grade, the kind that never really came clean no matter how much bleach you used when the bell above the door chimed with aggressive authority. Not the gentle ding of customers, but the sharp announcement of people who had come to make statements rather than wash clothes. Ryan walked in first, wearing his State Farm polo and the expression of someone delivering bad news to clients whose claims had been denied. Behind him came Margaret, his mother, dressed like she was attending a board meeting instead of visiting a laundromat. Her heels clicked against the linoleum with the precise rhythm of someone who'd never worked a day in a place that required comfortable shoes. "Madison." Ryan's voice cut through the ambient noise of washing machines and spin cycles, commanding attention from every customer who'd been minding their own business 30 seconds earlier. "We need to talk." I set down the towel I'd been folding, feeling my hands shake slightly from the industrial-strength detergent that had eaten away at my skin for 18 months. Around me, conversations died as people pretended to focus on their laundry while actually positioning themselves to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. "Here?" I asked, looking around at the elderly woman reading a romance novel by the dryers, the teenager texting while his clothes tumbled, the young mother bouncing a fussy baby while waiting for her spin cycle to complete. "Here's perfect," Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the laundromat with the authority of someone who'd never been told to lower her voice in public. "Everyone should see this. Everyone should understand what my son has been dealing with." Ryan pulled a manila envelope from under his arm, the same kind of envelope that had once contained federal briefings about explosive devices that could level city blocks. But this envelope contained something more devastating than intelligence reports, dissolution papers that would transform 3 years of marriage into another failed relationship statistic. "Madison Blake," he announced, loud enough for every customer to hear, "you are served with divorce papers on the grounds of irreconcilable differences." He slapped the envelope onto the folding counter like he was delivering a subpoena, the sound echoing through the laundromat like a judge's gavel. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her romance novel. The teenager stopped texting. The young mother turned toward us with the slow inevitability of people witnessing car accidents. "You'll never be more than this, Madison," Ryan continued, gesturing around the laundromat with theatrical disgust, soap suds and stains. A woman who spends her days touching other people's dirty clothes because she couldn't make it in the real world. The real world. While he'd been building his insurance career in air-conditioned offices, selling policies to suburban families who'd never face anything more dangerous than fender benders, I'd been dismantling explosive devices that would have turned American soldiers into casualty statistics in places that didn't exist on his GPS. "My son deserves better than this," Margaret added, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd never questioned her own superiority. "Better than a woman who smells like bleach and lives among other people's filth." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, it was worse. It was the sympathetic chuckling of people who thought they were witnessing someone finally get the reality check they'd been needing. The kind of amusement that said everyone had been thinking the same thing, but had been too polite to say it out loud. "Look at your hands," Ryan pressed on, warming to his performance while I felt my face burning with shame that had nothing to do with chemical exposure, raw from cleaning products, stained from other people's messes. What kind of future is that for someone who's supposed to be my partner? I looked down at my hands scarred not just from bleach and detergent, but from burns I'd sustained diffusing IEDs in Kabul while he'd been safe in college, studying actuarial tables and risk assessment formulas that had never included the possibility of improvised explosive devices hidden in roadside debris. But there was no way to explain that without violating the operational security protocols that had kept me alive through 6 deployments. No way to tell him that my stained hands had once saved lives while his had never touched anything more dangerous than insurance paperwork. "You've embarrassed me for the last time," Ryan concluded with the finality of someone who'd practiced this speech in his State Farm office mirror. "I can't introduce you to colleagues. I can't bring you to company events. You're a liability, Madison. A burden I can't carry anymore." A burden. The word hit that laundromat like an explosion, finding targets in every assumption I'd made about love, marriage, and the kind of partnership that was supposed to survive for better or worse. The silence that followed was absolute. 8 customers frozen in place, processing my public execution while I stood there absorbing every word like incoming artillery. The teenager had his phone out, probably recording what would become local social media entertainment. Mrs. Patterson was shaking her head with disapproval that had nothing to do with my marriage and everything to do with young people airing their dirty laundry in public. What they didn't know, what Ryan had never bothered to ask, was that the burden he was divorcing had once been essential to counter-terrorism operations that prevented attacks on American soil. That their embarrassing laundromat owner held security clearances that had taken years to obtain and commendations that sat in a shadow box I'd hidden to avoid making dinner guests uncomfortable. I looked at the divorce papers spread across my folding counter, like evidence in a trial where I'd already been found guilty of lacking ambition. Ryan's signature was confident, final, surrounded by legal language that would officially transform me from disappointed wife into discarded business liability. My hands trembled as I picked up the pen he'd brought for my signature. Around me, 8 people held their breath while I prepared to sign away a marriage that had apparently been more about his image than any actual partnership. The pen felt heavier than the tools I'd once used to disarm explosive devices that could have killed dozens of people. But as I prepared to sign my name, something stopped me. Not pride I'd lost that months ago when I'd started measuring my worth in loads of laundry completed and quarters collected. Not anger that would come later, when the shock wore off and I realized what I'd actually lost. It was clarity. The sudden understanding that some endings are beginnings, that some divorces are liberations, that some humiliations are just the price of discovering who actually deserves your loyalty. I signed my name with the same steady precision I'd once used to cut wires that determined whether American soldiers went home to their families or came home in flag-draped coffins. Ryan snatched the papers like he was afraid I'd change my mind and ask for another chance to embarrass him with my lack of social acceptability. "It's better this way," he said, not looking at me as he tucked the envelope under his arm. "For both of us, you can focus on your laundry business, and I can find someone who actually fits my life." He walked out of Sunshine Laundromat with Margaret beside him, both of them moving with the confident stride of people who'd just solved a problem that had been bothering them for months. Through the plate glass window, I watched them climb into his Honda Accord and drive away from the woman they'd just classified as worthless, probably heading to celebrate their liberation from my embarrassing career choice. The silence in the laundromat lasted exactly 1 minute before Mrs. Patterson approached my folding counter with the careful respect of someone offering condolences. "Honey," she said quietly, "any man who'd divorce you in public like that isn't worth the tears you're about to cry." But I wasn't crying. Standing there in my bleach-stained apron, surrounded by other people's laundry and the wreckage of a marriage that had never been built on solid ground, I felt something I hadn't experienced since leaving the bureau. Relief. Not because the marriage was over, but because I was finally free from pretending to be someone small enough for Ryan's suburban dreams. I slipped my wedding ring off my finger, the simple gold band he'd bought at K Jewelers when he thought marrying someone with government experience would make him look worldly, and dropped it into the wash basin beside me. The soapy water swallowed it without ceremony, like it had never existed. The nightmares always started with the sound of metal hitting concrete, that particular ring of IED components being assembled by hands that had learned to work faster than American intelligence could track them. Then the radio crackling with coordinates that meant civilians were about to die, while I tried to navigate through Kabul's maze of narrow streets, where every doorway could hide an ambush. "Foxtrot 27, we've got multiple devices in the marketplace." The voice would crackle through my headset while I crouched behind a Humvee, sweat mixing with dust under my Kevlar vest. "Immediate threat to 300 civilians. You're our only EOD in range." But I always woke up before the part where I saved them. Always jolted awake in my studio apartment above Sunshine Laundromat, sheets soaked with sweat, heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape memories I'd buried under industrial detergent and coin-operated normalcy. 3 a.m. became my constant companion. The hour when Cedar Falls went completely quiet except for the distant hum of Route 30 carrying late-night truckers past a town that had never seen anything more dangerous than drunk drivers and domestic disputes. I'd lie there staring at the water stain on my ceiling that looked like a map of Afghanistan if you turned your head sideways, trying to reconcile the woman who'd once diffused explosive devices under sniper fire with the woman Ryan had divorced for lacking social acceptability. The shadow box lived under my bed like evidence of a crime I'd committed against suburban expectations. Bronze star with V device. Purple heart. Explosive ordnance disposal badge. With 3 stars. Photographs of my team from the 755th EOD Company, men and women, who'd trusted me to keep them alive in places where one wrong wire cut meant body bags instead of homecomings. Agent Madison Blake, they'd called me then. Not laundrywoman or embarrassing wife, but agent. The title that had meant everything in a world where respect was earned through competence under pressure, not dinner party conversation and social media presence. But that world felt like someone else's life now. Someone braver, more certain of her purpose than the woman who flinched when the industrial dryers buzzed too loudly, reminding her of timer mechanisms on devices designed to kill Americans. The letter arrived on a Thursday that started like every other Thursday alarm at 5:30 a.m., coffee strong enough to strip paint, checking the coin mechanisms that kept my business barely profitable, while former colleagues earned federal salaries and pension benefits I'd forfeited when PTSD made undercover work impossible. Mrs. Patterson from the post office handed it to me with the same reverence she reserved for Social Security checks and IRS notifications. Heavy paper, official seal. City of Cedar Falls letterhead that meant someone in municipal government had something important to discuss with the town's least important business owner. "Mrs. Blake," the letter began, and I had to sit down on the bench outside the post office because nobody had called me Mrs. Blake since the divorce papers were signed. "You have been selected to receive recognition at the Cedar Falls Heroes Ceremony for your service in Operation Enduring Freedom, specifically your role in dismantling the terrorist cell responsible for the 2018 Kabul marketplace attacks." Kabul marketplace, the mission that had ended my active duty when shrapnel from a secondary device left me with traumatic brain injury and the kind of nightmares that made undercover work impossible. The mission where I'd saved 300 Afghan civilians while Ryan was probably studying for insurance licensing exams and planning our wedding. The ceremony will take place at Riverside Park on September 15th, with presentation by Mayor Richardson and coverage by regional media outlets. Regional media. While Ryan was explaining to his State Farm colleagues why he'd divorced the laundromat owner, I was being invited to receive public recognition for preventing mass casualties that would have made international headlines. I sat outside the post office, still wearing my bleach-stained apron, holding an invitation that would transform me from small-town failure into someone parents told their children about when they explained what real heroism looked like. The mission they were honoring had happened 4 years before I'd moved to Cedar Falls. March 17, 2018. Intelligence had identified a 7-man terrorist cell planning coordinated attacks on 3 civilian targets during Nowruz celebrations. The devices were sophisticated, remotely detonated, designed to kill families celebrating Persian New Year. My team had 6 hours to locate and neutralize 7 IEDs hidden in one of the most densely populated areas of Kabul. 6 hours to prevent what intelligence estimated would be 300 civilian casualties, mostly women and children attending cultural festivities. I'd found all 7 devices, disarmed them with 2 minutes to spare, while insurgents tried to detonate them remotely, turning what should have been a massacre into another day where families went home safely to dinner tables instead of morgues. The commendation had seemed sufficient at the time. I'd never expected civilian recognition, never imagined that a small Iowa town would somehow learn about classified operations that most Americans would never read about in history books. But sitting outside Mrs. Patterson's post office, reading an invitation signed by Mayor Richardson, I finally understood that some achievements transcend the people who refuse to acknowledge them. Ryan had divorced a laundromat owner, but the city of Cedar Falls was about to honor someone whose courage had prevented a terrorist attack that would have traumatized an entire nation if it had succeeded. The ceremony was 6 weeks away. 6 weeks for word to spread through town that their embarrassing business owner had been selected for recognition that most veterans only dreamed about receiving. I walked back to Sunshine Laundromat carrying a letter that would redefine everything my neighbors thought they knew about the woman who folded their clothes and counted quarters to pay rent on a business that barely kept her fed. The shadow box under my bed suddenly felt less like evidence of a life I'd lost, and more like proof of someone I'd always been, even when nobody else could see her under bleach stains and industrial aprons. Agent Blake was coming home. Not to Afghanistan, but to recognition that would silence every person who'd measured her worth in loads of laundry completed and social acceptability achieved. Ryan would learn about it the same way everyone else would, reading the Cedar Falls Gazette coverage of a ceremony where the mayor would honor the failed laundromat owner he'd divorced for embarrassing him at company events. The woman he'd discarded for lacking ambition was about to receive public recognition for saving 300 lives while he'd been memorizing insurance policy terms and practicing wedding speeches. And I was finally ready to let Cedar Falls see exactly who Madison Blake had been all along, not just the woman who ran their laundromat, but the agent who'd prevented tragedies they'd never hear about, carrying secrets that had kept them safe while they slept peacefully in beds I'd helped protect. Riverside Park had been transformed into something Cedar Falls had never seen before, a stage worthy of the heroes it was meant to honor. Red, white, and blue bunting draped from every lamppost, American flags snapping in the September breeze, and a wooden platform that had been built specifically for this ceremony, positioned so the entire crowd could witness what Mayor Richardson called recognition long overdue. 3,000 people filled the park, more than had ever gathered for anything in Cedar Falls history. Not the 4th of July fireworks, not the county fair, not even the high school football championships that usually brought out the whole town. Families spread blankets on grass that had been mowed to pudding green perfection. Veterans wore their dress uniforms despite the heat. Local news crews from Des Moines and Cedar Rapids had set up cameras that would broadcast this ceremony across Iowa and into neighboring states. I stood backstage in my Army dress blues, the uniform I hadn't worn since my retirement ceremony 4 years ago, when leaving the service had felt like amputation rather than transition. The ribbons on my chest told stories most civilians would never comprehend. Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Explosive Ordnance Disposal Badge with 3 stars. Each decoration representing missions where split-second decisions meant families went home intact instead of receiving folded flags. Through the side curtain, I could see the crowd settling into their seats while a high school marching band played patriotic standards that echoed across the park. But my eyes found them immediately, Ryan and Margaret sitting in the 8th row, dressed like they were attending a funeral instead of a celebration. They'd come, after divorcing me for embarrassing them with my lack of ambition, after publicly humiliating me at Sunshine Laundromat, after walking away from our marriage, like they were disposing of social liability. They'd come to watch the laundry woman receive recognition from the mayor, Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Richardson's voice boomed across the park through speakers that carried his words to every corner of the gathering. We are here today to honor heroes who served our nation in ways most of us will never fully understand. The crowd quieted with the immediate respect that comes when people realize they're about to witness something historically significant. Today we recognize someone whose courage prevented what could have been one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in recent memory, the mayor continued, his words carrying clearly across 3,000 people who held their breath waiting to learn which of their neighbors had been hiding such extraordinary service. Madison Blake. My name hit that crowd like thunder rolling across Iowa plains. Gasps rippled through the audience, sharp intakes of breath from people struggling to reconcile the woman who'd folded their laundry with someone being honored for preventing terrorist attacks. I walked onto that stage feeling 3,000 pairs of eyes tracking my movement, cameras broadcasting my approach to viewers across the Midwest who were meeting their laundromat owner for the first time as a decorated Army agent. The applause started immediately, not polite ceremony clapping, but sustained, thunderous recognition that filled Riverside Park like rolling storm clouds. Veterans rising to their feet. Families standing in respect. Local officials whose own achievements suddenly looked modest compared to what was being celebrated. Through the crowd, I could see Ryan frozen in his seat like someone who'd just witnessed something impossible. His confident suburban success, State Farm sales awards, company recognition dinners, the kind of achievements that impressed neighbors at barbecues, suddenly seemed microscopic compared to what was being broadcast on regional television. Madison Blake served as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist in Afghanistan, Mayor Richardson announced, his voice growing stronger with each word as he read from classified documents that had been declassified specifically for this ceremony. On March 17, 2018, Agent Blake single-handedly located and disarmed 7 improvised explosive devices that had been placed by a terrorist cell planning coordinated attacks on civilian targets. 7 devices. While Ryan had been studying insurance policies and planning our wedding, I'd been crawling through Kabul marketplaces with wire cutters and the knowledge that one wrong move would turn 300 Afghan civilians into casualty statistics. Her actions that day prevented what intelligence estimates would have been the deaths of over 300 innocent people, including women and children attending Persian New Year celebrations. 300 lives. The number hung in that September air like incense, carrying weight that made Ryan's divorce complaints about my lack of social acceptability sound like the petty concerns they'd always been. The standing ovation lasted 15 minutes. 15 minutes of sustained applause while cameras captured Ryan sitting motionless among 3,000 people celebrating the woman he'd discarded for running a laundromat instead of pursuing real career advancement. Margaret clutched her pearls like rosary beads, her face pale with the recognition that she'd spent 3 years treating a decorated Army hero like hired help who'd failed to meet her standards for daughter-in-law material. Furthermore, Mayor Richardson's voice cut through the sustained applause. Agent Blake's service record includes the Bronze Star for heroic achievement, the Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat, and commendations from commanding officers who describe her as essential to counterterrorism operations that kept America safe. Essential to counter-terrorism operations. While they'd been measuring my worth in loads of laundry completed, the United States Army had been measuring my value in American lives protected and terrorist plots prevented. As the ceremony concluded and I prepared to return to my seat among other honored veterans, I looked directly at Ryan for the first time since he'd walked out of Sunshine Laundromat with our signed divorce papers. He was crying. Not from pride he'd forfeited the right to that when he'd chosen his image over his marriage, but from something deeper. The recognition that he'd been married to someone whose courage had saved lives while he'd been worried about what his State Farm colleagues thought of his wife's career choices. Margaret was shaking her head with the slow disbelief of someone who'd discovered she'd been catastrophically wrong about something fundamental. The woman she'd treated like domestic help was receiving recognition that would be reported in newspapers across Iowa. That afternoon, as the ceremony concluded and Cedar Falls learned the story of Agent Madison Blake, Ryan would drive home to whatever suburban life he'd built without me, carrying the knowledge that he'd divorced a hero because he'd been too shallow to see past a laundromat uniform. But I would return to Sunshine Laundromat carrying something more valuable than any marriage certificate. the understanding that worth doesn't require recognition from people too small to see it. The laundromat had never defined me. The bleach stains had never contained me. The lies Ryan and Margaret had told about my failures had never touched the truth I'd carried. I was Agent Madison Blake, Bronze Star recipient, and no amount of industrial detergent could wash away what I'd achieved when it mattered most. The crowd finally saw what Ryan never could. I was never just washing clothes. I was protecting the freedom that let families gather safely in parks, celebrating heroes while sleeping peacefully in beds I'd helped defend. The truth had spoken louder than his lies, and Cedar Falls would remember this ceremony long after his insurance sales records were forgotten. Some achievements transcend divorce papers. Some recognition comes from sources that matter more than suburban approval. And sometimes the people who try to make you feel small discover they never understood how large you actually were. Madison's story reminds us that worth isn't measured by the opinions of people who judge us by our current circumstances, that heroes often work quietly in the most ordinary places, and that some achievements run so deep they can't be washed away by anyone's narrow definition of success. Right now, someone in your community is carrying a story you've never asked about. Maybe it's the veteran bagging groceries who once served in classified operations. Maybe it's the single parent cleaning offices who has medals hidden in a closet. Maybe it's someone whose current struggle masks a past filled with service and sacrifice you can't imagine. If this story moved you, if you've ever been underestimated based on your job, or if you've realized you might be making assumptions about someone's worth based on what they do for work, share this video. Let it reach someone who needs to know their past service matters, even when their present doesn't look impressive to others. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes, the veterans rebuilding their lives in civilian careers, the service members whose greatest achievements happened before you knew them, the people whose quiet strength protects freedoms we take for granted. Share this story with someone who's ever been judged by their current circumstances, who's rebuilding after service, or who deserves recognition for chapters of their life others never see. I was never just washing clothes, I was protecting freedom.